Conquest of Bread with Peter Kropotkin. Right now, today we're looking at chapters 4 through 6. Chris, you want to kick it off with this one, with the start of chapter 4?
Yeah, so start of chapter 4, we basically got we've got basically the introduction of this idea of expropriation. Am I saying that right? Expropriation. So it's the idea that you basically would take stuff from people and then you wouldn't really have an ownership, right? So in other words, you'd have kind of this collective ownership, but you wouldn't have a specific ownership of a specific thing. So you wouldn't have ownership of land. You wouldn't have ownership of companies, largely the means of production, these kinds of things. So he's setting up, in this chapter 4, he's setting up what expropriation is all about, and then he gets into the specifics in the following chapters after that, talks specifically about food, clothing, housing, that kind of stuff, because for each of those things there's obviously some issues that might arise when you're trying to expropriate that kind of stuff. So he talks about a situation where so Rothschild was, one of we've all heard that name before, because basically this is people who have been able to hold on to that wealth throughout time, right? And he talks about the situation where Rothschild admits, "I am quite willing to admit," said he, "that my fortune has been accumulated at the expense of others. But if it were divided tomorrow among the millions of Europe, the share of each would only amount to 4 shillings. Very well, then, I undertake to render to each his 4 shillings if he asks me for it," which is, of course, ridiculous, because how many people, especially poor people, are ever going to actually run across Rothschild and so be able to collect on that? And then also, it's kind of a silly idea that money in general wouldn't be used to give each person some amount of money. It would be expropriated so that there could be some kind of common good, something that you actually could achieve for the society as a whole. What do you think, Peyton?
Yeah, so I found it really fascinating how he opening up the book specifically telling this story of Rothschild facing calls to give away his money after it was being threatened by the revolution of 1848. So this is his strategy, right? This is the strategy of how Rothschild is going to keep his money, it would seem, by saying, "Oh, well, sure, yeah, I'll give you your 4 shillings," and he would hand it out with a sardonic smile, just smiling about it, because he knows that this isn't really how any serious revolution can come about. This is just to appease the masses. And he would, if someone came up to him, just smiling about it, because he knows that this isn't really how any serious revolution can come about. This is just to appease the masses. And he would, if someone came up to him, "Here's your 4 shillings. Here's your 4 shillings. Here's your 4 shillings," and then kept going on his way. And of course, he still had his wealth at the end of all that. And this goes to the sort of common conception of expropriation that the sort of middle class and upper class holds, according to Kropotkin, right? He lays it out at the beginning that he lays out this example, for instance, of whether or not, in order to expropriate overcoats, they would just pile up all the coats in the city and then have everyone jump on it and take all the coats. And he says this is a ridiculous concept of expropriation. And so he's kicking off the chapter of expropriation by specifically calling into question the common conception of expropriation. And then now he's going to move in to criticizing this. And he's saying that and then he goes on to say, like, sort of, what's the fault in this? What's the fault in this? Well, he says, quote, "But at the root of this argument, there is a great error. Those who propound it have never paused to inquire whence came the fortunes of the rich. A little thought would, however, suffice to show them that these fortunes have their beginning in the poverty of the poor." And this is how he's starting out his argument for how we need to expropriate. It's like, well, in order to figure out how we should expropriate, we need to figure out where their wealth actually came from in the first case.
Right.
And so that's how he's actually beginning this. And so he then goes on to tell us a little tale from the Middle Ages and how large wealth was accrued in the Middle Ages. He tells a story of how barons, once they got a large area of sort of fertile land in the valley, would put up signs to the passerbyers, to the people who were, traveling the land because they were poor, or because they had been forced out of their land from pestilence, or various other kinds of reasons, saying that you can come and live on this land rent-free for a certain number of years, then we will begin to rent you. Chris, you want to go through that story a little bit? You got anything to say about it?
Yeah, exactly. So those 2 points you just mentioned, I really like because I think it really sums up an interesting point that I see him making throughout these chapters that we're discussing today, but especially this first chapter, where, I think in this country we like to think of capitalism like, was it Mark Twain who said that Americans think of themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? So in this country, we're born with this idea that many of us are born either, middle or lower. And if we work hard enough, we'll rise up and we'll get out of that American dream. And if everyone just worked harder, there wouldn't be any poor. And one of the points that he makes repeatedly throughout this chapter is that poverty is not just that, well, we're not doing capitalism quite right, so there's still some poverty. It's actually necessary. You can't have this kind of a system without the poverty, because no one's going to work for what he repeatedly calls wage slaves, wage slavery. No one's going to do that. If you have food at home and you have your basic needs to live out a productive life and make sure that your family has a productive life, why would you go work for minimum wage at a job where they treat you like garbage? Why would anyone do that? So you literally have to have poor people for capitalism to function, right? If we raised up everyone's level of living, the capitalism wouldn't work anymore.
Right. So Kropotkin goes in to explain why that's the case. And he uses the example of the medieval baron, and he goes through the sort of present day, how that continues into the case of capitalism. So, for instance, the medieval baron, he gets people onto the land for free for a short amount of time. And apparently this is, according to Kropotkin at least, something that actually happened. I don't know enough about medieval sort of history to know whether or not this is the case, that they would put up these signs attracting people to come for a number of years. And then after maybe 8 years, 9 years, then they would start taxing. And then 3 years later, they'd increase the taxes. Then they'd, begin to institute various kinds of laws and so on and so on and so on, until you end up in a situation where people are essentially slaves and they can't leave the land.
Right.
And so that's an interesting example of how that actually came to be. And the example there, the clear case, though, is that those people never would have gotten into that situation, never would have gone into that situation had they not been poor. And so, in other words, the idea is that these people are poaching up on the valley. I can't help, I don't know if this was intentional or not, but using the idea of the feudal baron seizing upon the high points of the valley, that's one of the sort of quotes from the book. I wonder if that's an allusion to the idea of, robbers who would, sort of hide out along the high points of a passage and then sort of, pounce on passerbyers and the like. Now, I don't, I think that it's a pretty interesting observation to make there.
And I think it's important. He really hammers this point home, where I think it puts the power. A lot of times we think that the power, like in capitalism, lies with the capitalists because they're the one making all the decisions. But I think he kind of puts a point to it here to show us, hopefully to like motivate us, that the power actually lies with the workers, because he shows this baron that has all this land. So he seized some land. His land is not worth anything if there's no poor people there to work the land, right? He gets rich by taking his share from those people working the land. The only people that are going to come work his land are poor people. He needs poor people on that land in order to make him rich. He essentially has nothing. If the workers just one day said, no, we're not working, then that person has no money, just like the workers.
He makes a great example here, and it's curious how this compares to capitalism as it works today. But he says here, quote, "So the poor wretches come to settle on the baron's land. They make the roads, drain the marshes, build the bridges. In 9 or 10 years, then the baron begins to tax them." And so it made me realize, it sort of pointed out to me, like, how clearly it is the case that it's the workers there who are developing this land, and the owners aren't actually doing anything about it. One of the sort of great arguments that you oftentimes hear from defenders of capital is this idea that, well, the owners of land, they're the ones who actually uphold the land. They're the ones who end up, sort of developing, for instance, in the case of, housing is a little bit different, right? But it's the owners who end up doing the investment, and they end up, building it. But then, of course, it's actually the workers who are the ones who are doing it, they're just paying for it, right? But so there
Right.
may be a little bit of a sort of disanalogy there, is my point, between the sort of feudal argument that he's using to develop it and then the contemporary capitalist argument. It's still, of course, the case that it's relying on the exploitation of wage, but the sort of direct analogy does seem to be, there seems to be a slight difference there between, I think, the feudal case and the capital case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That was just one thing that I observed. Now, moving into part 2 of the next chapter, there he begins now to compare the feudal case to the capital case specifically, right? So then he goes into this example of a middle class person who suddenly finds themselves in possession of a large sum of money, in this case £20,000, and it becomes a question of, well, what do you do with it, right? Do you just live in senseless luxury of £2,000 a year? At this time would have been would have been senseless luxury for 10 years, and then run out of money. And he says, well, no, actually, the practical person, well, what they do is they keep their fortune intact and win themselves a snug little annual income. They go to the investment bank and they invest in some capital, and they take out a certain amount of money, and then over time they'll end up with a larger and larger and larger sum. And he goes on to conclude, in his case, he makes the argument essentially that this practicalness, the case of practical men, what they do, is nothing but grounding the face of the poor. That frugality in capitalism is nothing but grinding the face of the poor. Chris, what do you think about that particular case?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note this situation. It kind of goes back to this idea that, the only way this system works is by, grinding the face of the poor. I remember I actually read that a couple times when he said it, because it's obviously it's a very graphic description. And I think it's a good one, right? I mean, we have this idea, we're constantly told, well, in capitalism, if you just work hard enough, then you can do whatever you want. Well, has Jeff Bezos worked as hard as literally tens of millions of people put together? Like, is that effort that he put forward? No, he got where he is by grinding the face of his workers, right? We've all heard stories about his workers wearing diapers because they can't go to the bathroom, because they can't, they're not given enough time to go to the bathroom and get back in time, all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's really what this is about, is you're just exploiting the poor. And as we looked at, it doesn't work if you take that away, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the idea again being, of course, that these workers would not accept work from the capitalist if they had their basic needs met. Now, that's going to be a question that once we get to the end of this chapter, maybe we can ask some questions about. But that's his posit, right? Because he's saying that the wage system inevitably depends on their being poor. But I do think there's a question to be raised here. What does he mean by their being poor? Does he mean to say relative poor relative to other people? Or does he mean to say that there's an absolute level of poverty that once passed, people won't accept the wage system anymore? I think that's a question that we're going to have to ask Kropotkin as this book goes forward, as it unfolds, because that's the linchpin of his argument. If he's wrong there, he's wrong on a couple of other things.
Yeah, so I guess I think of it in terms of like a hierarchy of needs, right? Those are like basic needs that you need met in order to be somewhat, sort of moderately functional in society. When you get below that, and there's room for arguing over what those are. I would put in modern day, I would say in order to be a functioning member of society, you kind of need decent internet. Right. And yet we still have, some people would say, oh, internet, that's a luxury. You don't need that. But I don't know how you get a job if you can't fill out a form online and file your taxes and all this kind of stuff that everyone does online. But a lot of people still think of that as, I would think of it as like a utility. It's like electricity, water. It's things that you need in order to have a productive lifestyle. Once those things are met, and, I think maybe it comes down to, if you and someone else are trying to accomplish something and it's 10 times harder for you to do it, then there's some kind of inequality. Like, for instance, getting into college. If someone else has to work 10 times harder to get into college because their neighborhood has bad schools and all this kind of stuff, then maybe I'm kind of taking us off on a different track than just basic needs. But that sort of level of, we can't just leave people behind. so that, and just say, well, fend for yourself. It's
Right.
it's
Well,
capitalism.
I'm specifically referring to excuse me, his arguments against the wage system, right? Because
Yeah.
his argument is clearly that the wage system is an issue, and his argument against expropriation, because it's a historical form of argument, is that the wage system inevitably depends on there being poor. And that second point there being that once there are no more poor, then people will not be willing to accept the wage system. Then the question becomes, right? And this is an empirical question, right? This is a question which you can do studies, you could do research and try to figure out. Is a question of, well, is it the case that poverty, in that sense, in the sense that where we won't accept wage systems anymore, is one where it hits an absolute level where once these certain basic needs are met, then people will no longer take into the wage system?
Right.
Or is it the case that it's a relative comparison to one another, in which case, there are some questions? Or is it the case that one's conception of their basic needs changes with the relative sort of tides of society? But let's move on, because I think that we're going to get that question sort of answered for
Okay.
us. That's why I was sort of posing it early on to see, sort of what would come about. So in part 3, or was there anything else in part 2 that you were
Let's see. I'm
taking a
looking
look
at
at?
part 2. No, I thought it was interesting when he talked about 9/10 of the great fortunes made in the United States are the result of knavery on a large scale, assisted by the state. So he's kind of throwing that in there, that first of all, like these things that we think of, well, it's okay because it's legal. If something's legal, it's okay to do. But he's saying, no, this is essentially large scale knavery, which I think you could accuse. Let's name off billionaires. How far down would we get before we find one that we can't accuse of essentially stealing from their workers? And then assisted by the state. So he's throwing that in there, which I guess is true. If we have a system based on capitalism is stealing from people, then the state is effectively assisting that, especially since the state is the enforcement arm of these things, right? When someone, when there's a dispute over who owns something, a lot of times the state is called in to settle that dispute. So I think it's fair to say that the state shares some of that responsibility, or a large part of that responsibility.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, he links in the state there really closely with questions of industry. And actually, we're going to see a lot more of that, I think, in the next chapter, quite clearly. So, do you have any other thoughts on chapter 4? Do you want to just jump to chapter 5 then? Or
let's see. Nope, I guess that's good for 4, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so chapter 5 is, I think, really, really interesting, right? So chapter 5 is a little bit longer than some of the other chapters that we've seen in this book, but one of the sort of central ideas which he gives to us in chapter 5, or something I should say that, might help us make sense of chapter 5, is Aristotle's actual idea of sort of the virtuous mean, or sort of the mean of virtue, right? So if you're not aware, Aristotle presented this idea of virtue, and it was a unique idea at the time, that virtue is at the mean, and then there's sort of there's a vice of excess, and then there's a vice of deficiency. And Kropotkin is throughout the book, and he comes back to this idea of placing the utopian thinker, or who he sees as himself, in the mean between the theoretician and the practical man, who he calls the practical man. Both of them, he seems to think, have a kind of middle class bias, or a middle class, or an over concern with middle class. They're overly concerned with middle class things, and that this ultimately leads them astray. Of course, the theoretician being, when it comes to the question of revolution, being overly abstract, has their head in the clouds, all concerned with sort of the too abstract and not everyday things. The practical man being too concerned with the everyday thing, and then ends up missing the concern of bread, which is where,
right,
that we get the title of the book. Fantastic quote in there in chapter 5, which I'm sure we'll get to. But with that sort of in mind, let's go through chapter 5. Chapter 5 here, and specifically talk about his idea for revolution, because he opens up by saying that there's a lot of people who have these middle class concerns, ideas. For instance, on at least in my book, the first page, he talks about how a number of people are imbued with these what he's calling Jacobin ideas. The government occupied itself, first of all, with political questions such as the reorganization of the machinery of government, the purification of administration, the separation of church and state, civic liberty, and such other matters. It is the true workmen's club that they kept an eye on the members of the new government, which often imposed their own ideas on them. And that essentially he goes on to say that, sure, great ideas sprang up during these times, even ideas that moved the world, but the people were starving in the slums.
Right.
And so it's an interesting criticism to make of the so-called practical people, of the so-called theoreticians, that he talks about how these practical people were concerned every day, busy. They were busybodies trying to concern themselves on the machinery of government, but that they missed the fact that people needed bread, that people were hungry. I don't know. I thought that that was an interesting contrast to make.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting because he's basically accusing these people who keep creating governments of not understanding that until the people at the bottom, until those needs are met, where people have, obviously bread is a stand-in for a few different things, but it's that basic need that you have to eat, and until you do that, you're just not going to have stability in a government, because you're going to have at some point, it's like what we see in our capitalist society, where when capitalism keeps hitting the bottom, we've now done it twice in the last 12 years, where we really see devastation, and especially hitting the poor people the hardest. People are going to start questioning the system, and I think when it happens twice in 12 years, we're seeing a larger number of people moving towards being progressive, moving past being progressive, maybe even further left than that. And it's because I think people have witnessed firsthand what happens to society, and the people at the bottom, their needs are not being met by the system, not having enough bread. I have a question for you, so a historical question. I'm not an expert on history. He talks here on the next page about how basically the middle class are the ones who decide governments. When they say middle class, they don't mean middle class like we have in the United States, right? They're talking about a smaller, higher level middle class, right? Is that what he's referring to?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky question, because middle class can refer to a couple different things in this time period. And again, I'm not an expert either, right? So but from what I do know, the little bit that I do know about this is middle class oftentimes meant a kind of like tradesman class, or a kind of the classes are very different. I wouldn't necessarily map directly on middle class, what we mean today by middle class, to what he means by middle class, because I think there is a conception of like a very specific kind of job, a very specific kind of rent seeking, which is attached to the idea of middle class in his time, which we might not as well. He gives, for instance, in the previous chapter, the example of a tradesman who doesn't really actually trade, right? Like in the past, for instance, so this was in chapter 4. He talks about how in the past a tradesman would be someone who carried their stuff on their back, and then they really traded for the love of adventure in its own sake, and in a certain way. Whereas the tradesman today is someone, Kropotkin says, and this is written in like the 1860s, 1870s. And he's saying that the tradesman today basically can just sit at his desk, and also his goods are insured, so he's not really taking any risk, right? And so I think that this is kind of the idea of the middle class that Kropotkin would have. I don't think that middle class necessarily means like a certain sort of threshold of wealth. So
but in that case, it would be someone, if I'm thinking of the same example, that was a person who, instead of like, was it a shoemaker or something? Instead of making their own shoes, they start hiring people to make shoes, and essentially they own a business of shoes. So I guess the way I interpreted it, we're talking about like a smaller but maybe elevated group of people they would call middle class. Like I guess in some cultures, the middle class is considered people that have a large luxury time, right? They're not just sort of working all the time. Anyways, it's a small point, but I was just wondering, because he kind of says a lot of times he blames these societies on the middle class failures to consider the less fortunate and their needs for bread.
Right, and that's why it's, I think, linked to this idea of sort of the sort of virtuous mean that I was mentioning there earlier. That kind of the theoretician is overly concerned with middle class values, and the practical person, who he comes back to later on when he criticizes them, saying that they don't have any concept of how hungry people actually act because they've had their stomach full their entire life, right? That's the criticism of the practical people that he gets to later in the chapter. But the theoretician has been middle class, and so they're abstracting away all of these middle class concerns. So it's an interesting way there in which he seems to say that all of the revolutions have in the past have been essentially middle class in substance, and
Right.
that's one of the major criticisms of it. So yeah, I would say so. Actually, I want to read a quote here. This is right before the close of part one. He says, "The idea of the people will be to provide bread for all, and while the middle class citizens and workmen infested with middle class ideas admire their own rhetoric in the talking shops, and the practical people are engaged in endless discussions on forms of governments, we, the utopian dreamers, we shall have to consider the question of daily bread." Yeah, so I think that right there you sort of just saw the idea, how he's contrasting these utopian dreamers with the so-called practical people. He's saying that actually, no, it's absurd to say that concerning yourself with bread is actually utopian, and that it's the practical
Right.
people who are actually utopian because they're the ones who are sitting around sprawling questions of government, questions of checks and balances, and all these questions he would seem to say are absurd if you don't first tackle the question of bread, because
Right.
he does open up by saying that these are great ideas. He says that these are great ideas and that these ideas have moved the world and that certainly they're part of the revolution. So he's not necessarily dismissing the ideas of the practical person or the theoretician, but he's saying that these are not the first questions of a
Right.
revolution.
And I think it's interesting how that ties together with the last chapter where he talked about, well, in a capitalist system, you need the poor. And then now we're seeing how, well, in these systems, they're basically the poor aren't having any say on how this government is run. It's the middle class, the ones who middle class and higher, who are forming this government, the ones who benefit from the capitalist system, which is necessary. It necessarily needs to have a poor. So you can kind of see this circle here where it goes from, the capitalism needs poor people, and then also these governments are designed in a way to make sure there are poor people, that there are people who don't have their bread. So it's kind of a two steps going
Right,
together
and
on
he
this
actually
this line of
connects this,
reasoning.
and he connects that very idea. I mean, this might be skipping ahead a little bit, so we may have to go back. But he's mentioned this at the very beginning of part three when he's talking about attempts at state socialism. And again, this is Kropotkin's view, right? But Kropotkin here is criticizing many of these ideas of sort of what he's calling state socialism or state approaches to revolution because they leave the wage system intact. It's
Mm-hmm.
essentially saying here. So at the start of part three, let me just read the quote here. He says, "The most prominent characteristic of our capitalist system is the wage system, which in brief amounts to this, that a man or a group of men possessing the necessary capital to start some industry then undergoes to supply the factory and workshops with the raw materials to organize production, to pay for employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, blah, 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 blah." And then he goes on to say how collectivism as we know it, and this is going back to something he mentioned earlier, talking about, again, sort of state approaches of revolution, does not attempt to abolish the wage system, though it introduces considerable modifications to the existing order of things, et cetera, et cetera. He goes on to say that, like, it's not as bad as capitalism, right? That these approaches are not as bad, but he doesn't ultimately think. First of all, he straight out says he doesn't think that they're going to work. He says that that they're not even practical ideas. He doesn't think that they're going to work. But then he also goes on to say that they're not even the right approach to things anyway, because they don't abolish that wage system. They
Right.
still ultimately, because again, this is again that linchpin question about the wage system that we brought up earlier. He thinks that the wage system necessitates that there's poverty.
Right.
And again, this goes back to his conception of what poverty is. It goes back to this claim that he sort of makes, but doesn't necessarily argue for, at least as of yet. Maybe he will feature it, further into the book. But he's making the claim that poverty is an absolute position, that it's not a relative position where, you are poor relative to other people. That there's a sort of base level of poverty that once satisfied, you will not serve other people, essentially. That once that base level of needs are set, that you won't engage in wage system. Again, that's the empirical question that we're still waiting on an answer for the rest of the book that we got brought up in the last chapter.
Yeah, and his overall, he didn't say this specifically, I'm kind of reading into it, but his overall procedure seems to be that when something comes about that is problematic or can be abused or can get out of control, the answer is simply to eliminate it, right? So the wage system can be manipulated by capitalists. So as long as that wage system is there, capitalists can use it as leverage on people who don't have much power and they need to work. So that I kind of going back to what you were saying, the idea here is, well, this wage system will eventually turn into wage slavery, so simply don't have it. Same argument with the government, right? That he's making in the book is where he's saying, well, the government is problematic, so you just kind of don't have it, right? You don't have it.
Right. Well, it also goes back to the idea of the Baron that we mentioned at the beginning of it, which is that it gets worse and worse and worse. That's his argument, right? He argues that it just gets worse and worse and worse. At least that's sort of his claim there, essentially, that over time it's going to end up getting worse because, the state's just going to increase their power and hold on you. The capitalist is going to exploit you as much as possible.
Right.
So yeah, I want to go back a little bit then to part 3. I said there when I moved to part 3, back to part 2. I said when we moved to part 3 that we may be skipping a little bit ahead. He goes on to talk about, again, he's criticizing the practical men because it opens up with lots of criticism about the practical people. And then he, juxtaposing it to the utopian. And then he goes through and then talking about the theoretician, which he's again juxtaposing to the utopian, who he's calling himself concerned about bread. But again, anyway, he's going on to say, we do not know whether the folk who call themselves practical people have ever asked themselves this question in all of its nakedness, which is essentially the question of wages and the like. But we do know that they wish to maintain the wage system, and we must therefore expect to have national workshops and public works vaunted as means to provide food for the unemployed. And so there's this concern here. He's making a kind of criticism of middle class values where, why would we pay for someone who isn't working, right? And he makes a distinction later on how, at the beginning times of the revolution, we can't tell. I can't remember the exact words of this quote because it's not in front of me. But he says, at the beginning of a revolution, we can't tell who are the idlers and who are I can't remember the word, but who are the, real men who can't find work. Today, of course, we would add women. And I think that's I think an interesting, I found that quote there really interesting that he said that. He does seem to think in a certain way that idlers are going to be a problem, but that at the beginning of the revolution, the solution is, well, you just got to feed everybody.
Yeah.
And certainly, yeah, obviously you don't want people starving, duh. But I just found that to be an interesting just nugget quote that was just buried in there kind of,
right.
out of seemingly nowhere.
Which is a discussion when you talk about this kind of stuff. It's a very fair point that gets brought up, which is what about the idlers? And I think that would be worse at the beginning. If you think about the culture of the United States, if we suddenly took that system away that we currently have and moved to a system like this, I think there would be a large number of people that go, well, I can get my food whether I work or not, whether I could participate and contribute.
Chris, actually, Kropotkin has something to say about that, doesn't he? In the next chapter. So maybe we should save that in the question of.
Sure.
Actually, I guess. Actually, it's at the very end of this chapter. So yeah, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
We'll come back to that for sure because he does have something specifically to say on that exact point about whether or not people will start working harder and how long that might take. So he now sort of goes into criticizing the theoretician. And one of the major criticisms that he makes is actually a criticism of Marx here. He criticizes Marx's distinction between simple and complex labor. He says
Oh,
that
right.
these are these ideas that are dreamed up by theoreticians and economists, and he's linking in here. He's combining sort of criticisms of like typical economists that upholding capital, and he's also lumping in Marx there as well, which is an interesting thing to do that I don't think most leftists would do today. But it is something that Kropotkin seems to be doing. Specifically, the distinction that he's criticizing there is this far-reaching distinction between the work of someone who has earned a craft. Right. That's actually the quote. He says, moreover, collectivism draws a very subtle but far-reaching distinction between the work of the laborer and the man who has learned a craft. And he says that the unskilled laborer in the eyes of the collectivist is a simple laborer, and that the people who have learned a craft are complex laborers. And he's criticizing that distinction of apparently of Marx.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point to make because different jobs take a different amount of investment to get going, and I don't necessarily mean money investment. I mean time and education and these kinds of things. So it seems like definitely there's a discussion to be had there about what about someone who's going to go to school for say 6 years before they start up their job? Should that be treated differently? I think it's definitely a conversation. I don't know what the answer is, but it's definitely a conversation that I think has to be had.
Yeah, well, he does go on to talk about. Actually, let's just skip to that part, sort of at the end of the chapter where he's talking about some of this stuff. He uses a specifically biological example to argue that what we need to do is essentially we need to move into integration, what biologists call integration of functions. Let me read this quote and then we'll explain what it means. He says, the large towns as well as the villages must undertake to till the soil. We must return to what biology calls the integration of functions after the division of labor, the taking up as a whole. This is the course followed throughout nature. So again, we're returning to Kropotkin's longtime love of biology, and he's using this as an example to say that actually, if we want the revolution to work, what we're going to end up needing to do is that the cities, the people who are typical craftsmen, the people who are educated, are actually going to need to start tilling the land, and that they can sort of bring their scientific knowledge to bear. He talks about chemists and various kinds of scientists bringing their, like botanists, bringing their knowledge to bear in order to increase the production through various kinds of experiments on like smaller plots of land, and then going out and teaching the countryside how to then increase their own production. So he sees this kind of, it still has the division of labor, but it's using that biological example of how two different concepts can sort of integrate and come together to create a single function in an organism. It's an interesting it's an interesting analogy to make, to use the sort of biological analogy there between sort of city and body. But I don't know. What do you think of that? Because that's a partial answer to what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of wondering about that when I was reading it, about that point. Like, is the idea then that the culture would become super agrarian if everyone is sort of invested in growing things? I mean, does that mean that other industries are now going to have to pull back because more people are putting work into the land itself? And then I was thinking about, well, in modern society, we have so many, you can work land with so many fewer people than you used to be able to. I mean, half these machines are practically automated that are on the farm. The tractor just goes out there by itself and starts doing a bunch of stuff. So in some, and this I think is to back up what we saw earlier in the book, where Kropotkin keeps talking about how as time goes on, we can get more and more out of the land for less people. So I guess those were just questions I was considering while reading this.
Yeah. Kropotkin definitely, if you all remember from the beginning of the book, Kropotkin really lays out this idea that, we're increasing production, and that he uses this actually as like a foundational argument for why socialism is not only possible, but necessary in a certain sense. And I think that, if I'm being honest with you guys, I think that this is an example of something that may have worked. Like if the revolution happened during Kropotkin's time, it might have made a lot more sense. But nowadays, especially in like American society, it really is the case that like farmland is very, very, like I live pretty far away from farmland, right? Like I would have to drive out very, very far, like, at least an hour in order to go to work to till the farm. But I think the idea, though, would be that, if I was a botanist, or if I, had expertise in biology, that I would be able to perhaps, lend my expertise to developing different kinds of mechanisms or different kind of tactics to grow better in order to increase production for the laborers and for the farmers. So I think this is an example of something that maybe is a little bit different than, like, the exact division is maybe a little bit different than how it would be today if we were to try to implement something like that.
Right.
I want to go backwards just a little bit here, to talk about how Kropotkin is laying out this concern with food. So this is in part 4. It's maybe a page or two into part 4. He's talking about how a number of theoreticians, middle class theorists, this is where he links the middle class to the theorists. Previously, had linked the middle class to the practical people, but again, he's contrasting the theorists and the middle class. But he starts off one of the paragraphs here. There's a few paragraphs in. He says, "It is necessary to go into detail to prepare tables to show how the distribution of rations may work, to prove that it is just and equitable, and infinitely more just and equitable. And it is an infinitely more just and equitable state of things. All these tables and details will not serve to convince those of the middle class, nor, alas, those workers who are tainted with middle class prejudices, who regard the people as a mob of savages ready to fall upon and devour one another as soon as government ceases to direct affairs." And so this idea here, he uses some arguments to show that, if things got really tight, he uses specifically the example of water, where he says water is not allocated this way anymore, but he talks about how water at the time, the water companies wouldn't care essentially how much water you were using. And then if there was a time when water was a bit short, they would send it out into the newspapers and say water is short, and then people would sort of cut back on their usage of water. And so that is, I think, an instance where he is he's saying that actually people will willingly limit their intake, and he's saying that rations are the most reasonable thing, and it is indeed the thing that's just going to sort of spontaneously occur during a revolution. And he's saying that the theoreticians don't understand this because they're engaged in sort of middle class reasoning that, in fact, he has a lovely quote here. He says, "Only the man who is full fed does not understand this," referring specifically to how people will act when they, when there's a time of need. He goes on and talks about how any time that there's a sort of sickness or illness going around and that people are hungry, the first people who are allocated resources, according to Kropotkin, are the poor and the sick, right? And then, I mean, it's an interesting, I think, argument and case to be made. And he's saying here that, like, the middle class theorists who are theorizing about the end of capitalism, that, well, they just don't understand that, right? They're saying, well, you just don't understand that because that's just not how you think. You think that because that he's arguing that, well, you've always had your food given to you, and so as a result, you think that people are just going to be savages as soon as government displaced sort of leaves. What do you think of that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I thought about that, and I have that part with the droughts highlighted where they talk about how people will conserve when there is a drought, and I really thought about that. It seems to me like a lot of the ideas in this book come down to basically what your view of humanity is. Like, do you think humanity is something where people will step up and realize we're all a society and help each other? Or is it going to be like, when we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, when there were toilet paper shortages, where people were literally buying truckloads of toilet paper and hand sanitizer to turn around and try to sell at exorbitant prices? And then you have to ask yourself, well, I guess if we didn't have a capitalist system, if we didn't have wages, then there wouldn't be the incentive to buy a truckload of toilet paper and try to turn around and flip it for a profit.
Right.
Or would you still have hoarding and people doing the same kinds of things?
Right. I think that's the point there, because, again, he's actually making the case that your view of human nature is shaped by your upbringing. So he actually is moving a little bit beyond what you just sort of said there. He's saying that actually the view of human nature given, by the middle class there is not accurate because they've had their food always given to them
Right.
sort of the whole time. So he would, I think, slightly disagree with you and say it's actually not necessarily about your view of human nature. In fact, your view of human nature is shaped finally by your upbringing and by your sort of material upbringing there. I don't know. I mean, I think that that's an interesting case to be made, and I think it's certainly right, right to some extent. I mean, it goes that sort of nurture nature debate
Right.
in biology, which has mostly been settled at this point. But it's it's basically like it's both. But
Right.
like it's kind of an interesting point to be made. Interesting point to be made there. I think that he is right to say, or at least it's an interesting point to be made here that someone who has only ever experienced one kind of life, the full fed life, is not going to be in a good place to be a theoretician universally of society. I think that
Right.
that's like if you were to sort of boil it down to like a bumper plate case. I think that that's a good case, and it's almost obvious, right, when you say it that way. Like someone who's only experienced one kind of life probably isn't too great at being a
Right.
theoretician. So it's an interesting point there.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else to add on this section here? Or?
I don't. Nope. Not on that one.
All right. So you want to move in then, because we already mentioned sort of the end of chapter 5 there. You want to move into chapter 6 on dwelling?
Sure. Sure. Yeah. This was this was one that I definitely had to wrestle with some ideas, some of the things that were being brought up in this book, because it's a little little scary idea to think that someone might tell you that you don't get to live in your house anymore. I'm a big fan of my house. It's not like a new house or anything like that, but it's I do like it. So it definitely makes me a little uncomfortable to think that it might be decided that, once the kids are out of the house, that this is too much house for, say, me and my wife, and that we would better serve society if I was now living in a smaller house and a larger family got to move into my house instead, right? So,
right.
So
let's just go through it. Let's go through his arguments first. You
right.
want to go through his arguments and see if we find them compelling, and then we can sort of air out you can air out your concerns with it.
Well, yeah, and I just want to make clear, I'm not saying that I disagree with all the points or that all the points in this chapter are wrong. I'm just saying they make me uncomfortable, right? Because they're sort of it's challenging these ideas. So
I will say I will just make one quick point about that. Something that I've realized is if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, it's probably not a revolution. And right. I mean, you could argue then whether or not you want a revolution, right? Do you ever want to be uncomfortable? But if you think that it's necessary, well, anyway, I don't know. That's right. Just something that I've learned. Sometimes some ideas make you uncomfortable. Yeah. A lot at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. In a good way. I mean, they challenge you. They make you confront stuff.
Yeah. And so anyway, so his argument is essentially that well, he actually makes a historical argument saying that workers are actually, let me just read the quote here. He says, the workers are becoming more and more gradually coming to the conclusion that dwelling houses are in no sense the property of those, the property for those of whom the state recognizes as their owner. And he goes on to essentially argue that this is going to continue and that more and more workers are going to get this idea in their head that their property is not really belonging to their owners. Historically, that may not have borne out, but it's also a question there of, I think the relationship has changed a little bit there, whereas, in the past, it really was the case that these were entirely being rented out, whereas now there are more people who are able to become owners of single homes, because, I mean, I think that the kinds of things that he's criticizing here are in here where, you're a landlord and you own hundreds of different buildings, and there's definitely still lots of criticism of that. And I think that a lot of people even still do agree with those kinds of criticisms here. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so going to the substance of his argument against it, he's saying that the home, first of all, he says here, quote, the house was not built by its owner. It was erected, decorated, and furnished with innumerable workers in the timber yards, in the brick fields, in the workshops, toiling for dear life at a minimum wage. And then he goes on to say that the money spent by the owner was not on the product of his own toil. It was amassed, like all the other riches, by paying the workers 2/3 or only a half of what was their due. So, it's essentially built on exploitation. So this goes back a little bit earlier to what we were talking about, the baron and setting up land and trying to take things from, trying to sort of exploit people with enticing them essentially with lower wages for a short amount of time. But then he makes a really interesting point here. He says here, quote, "The house owes its actual value to the profit which the owner can make out of it. Now, this profit results from the fact that this house was built in a town. That is, it is an agglomeration of thousands of other houses, possessing paved streets, bridges, walkways, fine public buildings, and well lit and affordable to its inhabitants, thousands of comforts and convenience unknown in villages." So essentially, the value of the house is based on the value of other homes in it. And furthermore, that value is based on the rents which people pay. Right. So in other words, the value of the home is based on the rent which you can possibly make from it. And this is, of course, especially true in the case of, landlords who own lots and lots and lots, right?
Right.
Which is especially true. I mean, in fact, empirically, generally, your rent is about equal to 1/20th of the actual value of the thing. That's an interesting observation that Thomas Piketty has made about sort of the value of property, which can be rented like just universally. Like that seems to be a general trend across cultures, right. That as we know so far. So it's an interesting claim to be made, and I thought that was a fascinating argument. And it goes in, I think, a little bit there to some of the earlier arguments that we heard against ownership for like machinery and for the ownership of capital. The idea that all of these inventions are conglomerations of previous inventions, and that, in fact, ideas like maybe even the number system or various kinds of abstract ideas can help us produce new ideas going into the future. So all of these inventions are not really the invention, are owned by the inventor exclusively, but are common inheritance, common ownership. That's some of the stuff that he talked about earlier in the book, and he's kind of reapplying that logic down to the question of dwellings.
Yeah, and the point you were making a little while ago about the value of a home being related to the things about it, he even takes it a step further and saying, well, a home in Paris, right, is going to be more expensive, and yet it sort of owes all of that to everything else that's happening in Paris, right? It's sort of this larger collective. And housing's a tricky one because, especially in this country, you're brought up to believe that home ownership is part of the American dream. That's one of the things you one day hope to achieve, is you have a nice house for your family to live in and raise your kids on a nice street and that kind of stuff. And yet, some of I think the most obvious and maybe egregious forms of or violations maybe caused by capitalism happen in homes, like we saw after the last economic downturn, 12 years ago or so. We saw a lot of hedge funds swoop in and buy massive numbers of houses, which did two things. One, it shortened the supply for people who wanted to meet that American dream. There were less houses for sale because they were being bought up by hedge funds. And that also it raised the prices of the remaining homes, so that it's even harder for those homes that are left. It's harder for people to buy a home. So here we see this sort of American dream of being a homeowner is actually being destroyed by the capitalism itself. And that's a good argument for, maybe people shouldn't be able to own 100 homes or, maybe even 5 homes, owning more than 5 or whatever. Like maybe there should be some sort of elevated tax for each extra rental home you have or something. But that would be a capitalist approach to sort of fixing the problem. And so his approach of where there just isn't home ownership would sort of fix that problem, because hedge funds wouldn't swoop in and buy 1,000 homes in a region.
Well, what's interesting about it is he seems to think that this would be during the revolution, right? So it would be at the beginning of the revolution. We would take sort of tally of the homes and dwellings that we have. And most specifically, the thing that he seems to be most worried about, right? Like, let's not sort of caricature him or whatever, because the thing that he seems to be most worried about is the fact that there's a bunch of empty homes. There's a bunch of homes out there. In fact, he claims that there's enough empty homes out there to house everybody who doesn't have a home.
Yeah.
And in fact, Chris, that's something that's still the case today. There are enough empty homes out there that every single homeless person could be given a full house. House. And I remember when I was in high school learning that statistic and just being shocked. I was like, whoa. I mean, it was, in fact, actually, that was one of those statistics out there that was part of my radicalization, hearing that statistic. I was like, that's just absurd. That is completely wrong. That's just irrational. That was sort of my gut reaction. And I think that general idea is the same thing which is motivating him here. I don't know that he's necessarily talking about like invading people's sort of private space or anything like that.
Well,
I think that,
at some
I
point
mean,
he does.
I mean, he pushes towards it, but I think that a lot of it is motivated by this idea that, at least initially, if we want to have an equal allocation of resources, so that we don't have wage slavery sort of
Right.
recurring and recreating itself. Again, we need again vis-a-vis sort of Kropotkin's argument for why the wage slave exists or why the wage system exists. Well, part of the only way to get rid of the wage system would be to make sure that everybody has housing. And
Right.
so this may be something that's sort of at the beginning of the revolution, and not necessarily like we're constant, in your case, right? Like you're
Yeah.
allowed to have your home now because you have children, and then all of a sudden, your kids go off to college, and you get booted out of your house or
Right.
something like that. I'm not sure that that's what Kropotkin has in mind.
I mean, it's definitely sort of suggested at some points. I mean, they talk about like, and this is on the sort of the extreme end where he talks about, the servants' quarters. So you're not talking about normal working people like myself that have to go to a job. You're talking about people, ultra rich people, but the servants' quarters would be turned into a dwelling for someone, and the big mansions might house a few families instead of just the one family. But then he does talk about a situation where you have one owner with a house with a bunch of rooms, and then you have a mother. I think he said a mother with 5 children where they're all in one room. So then you'd send in the tradesman to fix up that house so that now it could house the woman and her 5 children as well as possibly the individual who was living there before. So there definitely is not like clear cut about exactly what he's talking about, but he definitely talks about moving people out of I think he calls them hovels, and moving them into I think he said 5-room houses.
Well,
So,
one of the other interesting points that he makes related to that is he says that actually once we get rid of the wage system, people won't have any need or even any want of these massive mansions
right,
or these massive homes. I think he is more worried about the mansion than he
right,
is worried about, someone, like, like yourself
right,
with a few rooms for your kids. Because he specifically talks about how rich people who previously, they enjoyed their large home, now that they don't have the servants working for them, then they're going to want to leave their home because they realize how just, what hell it is
right,
to have to manage this massive
right,
home, keep all the, this massive lawn cut. And so he even essentially says that like people are just going to leave their massive mansions if they don't have people working for them at an exploitation wage. Right.
right.
So I mean, I suppose depending on sort of your political leanings, you might think that that's hand waving, or you might think that that's sort of just the continuation of his argument there. But it's an interesting case to be made nonetheless. And I
Yeah,
think that it does go to suggest that he is thinking more about mansions,
right.
and he is thinking more about sort of very wealthy people, and
Which
possibly even sort of
I
the beginning of the
suspect is
revolution.
true. I think that's true. He is more concerned about the big stuff, although he does keep kind of saying, "Well, to each their needs." So we'll
Right.
organize by I
Well,
guess you would look at the homes and you would look at the people, and then you would start assigning. And who knows what's going to happen if you had an actual revolution? Who knows what would happen if that was actually taking place? But there are some good points being made here.
Right. And I mean, certainly I agree. Like everybody obviously needs to have a home.
Right.
I mean, that's right. Now, one other point I want to make, because he's coming back to this idea of the theoretician. He talks about how the theoretician is constantly requesting, or, sort of their middle class values, like how we need to pay compensation to landlords. He says here, quote, the people will proceed to expropriate the housing without giving heed to the theories which will certainly be thrust in their way, theories about paying compensation to landlords and finding first the necessity of the funds, right? So this is something which held up revolutions for a long time. Historically, like sort of in the French Revolution, it was the idea, well, we need to pay compensation to landlords. In fact, when slaves were freed, it was everywhere. Oh, well, I shouldn't say everywhere, but in many places, the idea was, well, we have to pay back the slave owners for their compensation. It was never, ever, not once done where, well, maybe we should compensate the slaves for being owned. Now, again,
Right.
he's not talking about slavery here, but there is this idea that he's linking in here. He says earlier up, one paragraph up, he's linking it to middle class values again. He's saying, are we going to wait till this measure, which is in harmony with every honest man's sense of justice, again, getting rid of landlords, is taken up by the few socialists scattered among the middle class elements of which the provisionary government will be composed? So again, he's linking sort of state approaches to socialism with the middle class there, and how he seems to think that there's this connection there. And I think that this is sort of where we see the connection between the practical side of things and the theoretician, that these people are in there together in forming the sort of state government, because again, Kropotkin being a bit of an anarchist there. So it's an interesting, approach there. He's kind of bringing in together, melding together these ideas that he was playing around with in the previous chapters right there.
Right. Yeah.
So do you have any other thoughts on dwellings? Or
I don't think so. I guess one more point, he mentions here, he's at the beginning of sort of the opening section of this chapter, he really kind of puts the importance on the dwellings and kind of makes it like it's not a revolution until you have done this. He says, on the day that the expropriation of houses takes place, on that day, the exploited workers will have realized that new times have come, that labor will no longer have to bear the yoke of the rich and powerful, that equality has been openly proclaimed, that this revolution is a real fact and not a theatrical make-believe like so many other preceding it. So he's saying that it seems like he's kind of putting a line in the sand. That's when you know you've had a revolution, is when the expropriation takes place.
When we've gotten rid of property relationships.
Right.
I think that, if I'm being honest with you, Chris, I think that part of the reason why this is why he, as that quote there bears out, why he's putting such strong emphasis on this, is because I think property was much more connected to capital at this time. Like land property was much more connected to capital at this time. Whereas today, there's a lot of capital which is sort of in software or in ideas and information. So today, I think that the revolution might bear slightly different stamps than it would have been or during this time. I could be wrong about that. And I still think, obviously, making sure that everybody has homes and, that's obviously, you can't have a revolution without, right? Duh.
Right.
But I do think that there might be other points which today's revolutionaries should concern themselves with.
Right. But I do see some of the points he makes, that if you kept home ownership at the same time that you followed these other steps of expropriation,
landlords, right?
It's sort of leaving this abuse in place, to abuse the different classes, for one class to abuse another class and take advantage. And I think that point,
right, which means that we could never root out the wage system,
right,
according to Kropotkin.
Right. Yeah.
So, is that about it for today's section, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome.
So I looked. The next 3 chapters are only about 20 pages or so, I think.
7.
Let's see, 7, 8, and 9. Yeah, it's about not even 20 pages. So should we do 3 more for next week?
Yeah, let's do 3 more. We've been doing 3 chapters so far. Chapter 5 was a little bit longer than some of the other chapters, but yeah, these 3 chapters seem reasonable. So next time around, if you guys want to join us, we're going to be looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9. So thank you all so much for joining us for Kropotkin.